Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. US and Iranian negotiators finished talks in Rome with reports of some progress. Israel's Prime Minister accuses the UK, France and Canada of siding with Hamas. A federal judge blocks the Trump administration's decision to bar foreign students from enrolling at Harvard just hours after the university sues. Now to our top story. The latest round of US and Iran nuclear talks have finished in Rome today. The Omani foreign minister, who mediated the talks, said they concluded with some but not conclusive progress, adding that he hoped the remaining issues will be clarified in the coming days. President Donald Trump is pressing for strict limits on Iran's ability to enrich uranium, part of a wider push to prevent a nuclear arms race. For more on this, I'm joined by Jason Brodsky, Policy Director of United Against a Nuclear Iran. Jason, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us. So the talks have concluded with some but not conclusive progress. When President Donald Trump was visiting Qatar, he said he believed Iran had agreed to key conditions. Is there anything firm we can hang some hope on today?
I don't think so, and it's great to be with you. I would say that the some but not conclusive progress is really a standard readout. It's the rule, not the exception, for how negotiations with the Islamic Republic of Iran go on the nuclear file. So I think that there was not a breakthrough, but not a breakdown at this juncture. I think both sides want to continue this process, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're any closer to bridging the gaps on the positions. The U.S. is demanding zero enrichment in Iran, but the Islamic Republic wants to try to lure President Trump into JCPOA 2.0, despite the president rightfully repudiating that original JCPOA agreement.
And I just want to take a step back and set a backdrop to these talks by referencing various reports suggesting that Israel is preparing to strike Iran's nuclear sites. How legitimate are these concerns, and what will the consequences be?
Well, I think Israel is absolutely preparing for a potential military strike. It's been doing so for years, so I don't think that that's anything really new. I do think that it's in the interest of the United States to dangle Israel's preparations publicly in the development of a credible military threat, as that aids and complements diplomacy with the Islamic Republic. And traditionally, that's been the case, to try to get the Islamic Republic to agree to the U.S. conditions in this negotiating process. So that's part of the calculation as to why you're seeing public reports as to Israel's preparations for a potential military strike on the Islamic Republic's nuclear program.
Jason, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei earlier this week said Tehran won't seek permission from anyone to enrich uranium and called US statements nonsense. So you touched on a few points there, but what are the major sticking points right now in these talks?
Well, I think the Islamic Republic of Iran has been operating under the assumption that they could get President Trump to agree to a repackaged version of the same JCPOA that he withdrew from in 2018. But I think recent statements from U.S. officials have really given Tehran a rude awakening, that they are not necessarily going to revert to that Obama-era playbook. And the U.S. position that has been expressed by President Trump, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Special Envoy Witkoff, is that zero enrichment is a red line for the United States. And you also hear House and Senate Republicans in the United States reinforcing and backing up that messaging. So right now there's a chorus of voices in Washington all singing from the same song sheet that there must be zero enrichment in Iran as a part of this deal.
But let's be honest, Jason, Iran is never going to accept that, are they?
Well, I think that we don't know that. there needs to be a more concerted pressure campaign against the Islamic Republic if it's not prepared to accept that. The U.S. is allowed to have red lines, and so is the Islamic Republic in these negotiations. But it is not the United States that has to face an economic crisis, an energy crisis, a crisis of confidence between state and society, as well as a deterrence crisis. That is the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the United States doesn't need these talks. The Islamic Republic does, and that's why you will see the Iran, despite complaining publicly that their red line is a limited enrichment program in Iran. Despite that, they will continue this negotiating process because they needed to continue for as long as possible, because the process itself is a shield from pressure and military strikes as well.
With the ongoing war in the Middle East, which we've been touching on, does Iran have any leverage at all in these negotiations?
Iran has leverage. Iran has diminished leverage, though. Iran has elements of its proxy and partner network that are still in place. The Houthis, despite being degraded by U.S. airstrikes, are still a force in Yemen. The Iranians also have the Iraqi Shia militias as well. But that is only, that's really a shell of its former self in terms of all the losses that the Islamic Republic has faced over the last year plus, with Hamas being decimated, Hezbollah being badly degraded, the Assad regime being ousted in Syria, and now there have been reports that some pro-Iran factions of the Palestinian militant groups have been asked to leave Syria. So that's a shock for the Islamic Republic as well, and a setback for its regional agenda. So these have all been losses here, and that's not even getting to touching the domestic picture inside Iran, with economic problems, energy problems, water problems, and the list goes on. So they are in a very dire state, and that's why they need this negotiating process to continue for as long as possible.
Jason Brodsky, Policy Director of United Against Nuclear Iran. Fascinating to have your insights. I appreciate you joining us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Now, a prisoner exchange between Russia and Ukraine has been taking place today as a result of initial talks in Turkey last week. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the first stage of the 1,000 for 1,000 prisoner swap has now been completed. So far, both sides have swapped 390 prisoners of war each. It's been described as the biggest prisoner exchange since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. I'm now joined by John Kavulich, a senior editor for outcome modelling analysis at Issue Insight. John, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. First of all, how big of a deal is this prisoner swap between Russia and Ukraine? 1,000 detainees each is no small number.
It is an impressive number. It is the largest of the multiple prisoner exchanges that have taken place now into the fourth year of the Russian-Ukraine war. The fact that it was an item on the agenda for the meeting in Istanbul demonstrates that the Russians and the Ukrainians can sit in a room. They can agree on a particular issue. They can formulate a solution to the issue. They can implement the issue or implement the solution. So it is a big day, particularly when you look at it from the human side of it, which is, let's say those 1,000 people on each side, that they have families and immediate families and extended families. And let's say there may be 5 or 10 people per each. So today, 5,000 to 10,000 people are feeling better than they did yesterday. So that's a good thing.
Yes, absolutely. John, President Trump acknowledged the exchange and suggested it might actually signal progress towards a broader peace deal. From your perspective, how significant is this exchange in context of these ongoing peace efforts we have discussed a few times on the show?
I think we would all like it to be a flag that demonstrates that both Russia and Ukraine are on a trajectory. And President Trump, of course, he gravitates toward anything that he hears as the largest and the biggest. So it wasn't a surprise that he would issue the statement he did. And then also with his usual enthusiasm, I hope it leads to something else. Unfortunately, at the moment, as President Trump himself has said publicly and maybe more so privately, that he doesn't see a great trajectory for anything substantial, primarily because, as he's reported to have said to some of the EU leaders and President Zelensky, that President Putin believes he's winning, so therefore, why give in to anything? So I'm not optimistic that this particular prisoner swap will lead to anything larger. However, it should lead to a continuation of prisoner swaps, and maybe those will get larger and larger, which is also good.
And this all happened without a ceasefire in place. How tricky is it to pull off something like this when the fighting hasn't stopped?
The governments have been very good at this. In this particular case, Belarus is involved, where the Russian exchanged people, the military folks and the civilians will go through Belarus, then to Russia. So, in 4 years, the Russians and the Ukrainians have gotten good at killing each other, and they've also gotten good at exchanging with each other and making certain that what they agreed to is implemented. So, as I said, I'm not, optimistic that this will lead to a tremendous amount of other things. However, the fact that it did take place without a ceasefire is somewhat problematic, because President Trump initially said he wanted a 30-day ceasefire. President Zelensky then agreed, reluctantly, but agreed. President Putin, was vacillating, but then eventually, he's not interested. The more that the two countries can get done without a ceasefire puts more pressure on Ukraine, more pressure on the US, more pressure on NATO, EU countries to say, all right, if he's not going to stop, then we're just going to have to play it the way President Putin wants it to be played. It's unpleasant, but that's one of the downsides of doing something good, which this prisoner exchange was.
And John, do you think this prisoner swap could open the door for more countries like the US to play a bigger role in getting both sides to the table? You just mentioned there NATO, you also mentioned the UK. We mustn't forget that Europe is also being heavily involved in this.
Yeah, and that also is a problem, because President Zelensky has always said, I want everyone at the table behind me, so that on the other side of the table, President Putin can see it's not just Ukraine you're negotiating with and that you have to satisfy, it's everyone supporting Ukraine. President Putin's perspective is, no, I don't think we need third parties or fourth parties. This is between you, Volodymyr, and me, Vladimir. And so it sets up a challenge, because the EU has wanted to be a part of the process. They wanted to be a part of the process in Saudi Arabia. They wanted to be a part of the process in Turkey, and they weren't. Some NATO members, the same thing. President Trump, of course, has said, look, I just want to sort of help push them both together, but I'm really not interested in hashing out the details. I just want it all to stop. So, my guess is that, from President Putin is going to probably have the upper hand here by saying to the Ukrainians, look, there's no reason for other people. You want to talk to people on the side, be our guest. But when it comes to the next round of negotiations and discussions, it's going to be you across from us, and maybe the host country will be there. So that that presents some problems, particularly ego problems among some of these heads of state and heads of government, where they feel, hey, we put a lot of money into supporting Ukraine. We put a lot of pain for our own taxpayers in terms of the sanctions on Russia, which have harmed taxpayers in terms of higher energy costs and that. So we should be at the table. But in the end, the war, yes, it's a proxy war, but it is a war between Russia and Ukraine, and they have to be the ones to say no more.
John Kavulich, Senior Editor for Outcome Modelling Analysis at Issue Insight. It's always brilliant to have you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has accused UK, French and Canadian leaders of siding with Hamas by condemning Israel's recent military actions in Gaza. His comments come after a deadly shooting at the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., where 2 staff members were killed. The attacker reportedly shouted, "Free Palestine." We can now go live to London to speak to our correspondent there, Olly Barratt. Olly, thank you so much for joining us. A horrendous attack in Washington, but what has Downing Street had to say about Netanyahu's latest comments?
Well, the response, Leigh-Ann, from Downing Street has been to point to the condemnation from Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, but also other government figures of that attack, of that incident in Washington. We've been hearing today from Luke Pollard, a government minister, has been doing the broadcast round of interviews. He's been pressed on the UK position when it comes to any response to Benjamin Netanyahu's criticism. And again, he pointed towards Keir Starmer, insisting that the shooting was anti-Semitic. That's how Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, described it on Thursday. Luke Pollard saying that he condemns fully the murders of the Israeli diplomats in the United States and stressing that the Prime Minister had done so publicly as well. But Luke Pollard, the minister speaking for the government today, and Downing Street and other government ministers over the last 48 hours have been very clear to stress that they will continue to say to Israel that they believe that the expansion of military operations in Gaza is the wrong way to proceed, and that they will also call on Israel, continue to call on Israel to expand the amount of aid and food that's being allowed into Gaza.
Olly, Netanyahu accused the 3 leaders of being on the wrong side of justice, humanity and also history. How fragile is the relationship right now between Israel and its so-called allies?
I think it's more fragile than it has been for some time. Certainly relations between the UK and Israel are at a recent low. It was very clear from about Monday this week when Keir Starmer was asked in a press conference actually about something else entirely, about the situation in Gaza, and he came out with very strong language, stronger language than we had seen for some time. It was clear at that point that the UK tone and position towards Israel was starting to shift, that patience was low with Israel and its actions inside Gaza. But we've also, of course, seen that statement from the French and the Canadians along with the British. We've been hearing from Germany today, insisting that it believes that the amount of aid that has been allowed into Gaza is too little, too late and too slow, is how it's been described by the German government spokesperson today. It appears that privately there may be some patience sapping in parts of the Trump administration too. So I think you're quite right to point to really strained ties at the moment between Israel and some of those countries that up to now, since October the 7th, have been its strongest backers and strongest supporters.
Indeed, Olly. Earlier this week, the UK promised £4 million in humanitarian aid to Gaza. As you just mentioned, Starmer's government has been heavily critical of the lack of trucks crossing into the Strip. What more do we know about this humanitarian aid?
Well, this is something that the government continues to stress here in the UK, that it will continue to talk to Israel about, but also continues to talk to other allies about as well. It's been described, the humanitarian situation in Gaza this week, by the UK government, by Keir Starmer and his Foreign Secretary David Lammy as well, as intolerable. They have been very critical of the pace at which aid has been allowed into the Gaza Strip. And when David Lammy gave a statement to the House of Commons in the middle of this week, the Foreign Secretary told MPs that the UK would continue to press Israel to make sure that more aid was being allowed into Gaza. That remains the UK government's position today, also working with NGOs and charities and diplomatic formations in the region to try and make sure that the push from Britain for as much aid as possible continues. As I say, that is very much a position from the UK government that's been re-stressed today.
Olly Barratt in London, always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for joining us. We can now go to Gaza to speak to Dr Tommo Potar. Good evening to you, Doctor. Thank you so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. You've described the situation in Gaza as horrific. Can you tell me more about the conditions you're witnessing on a daily basis?
Yes, thanks. Good evening. So, I mean, there's a number of things happening. One, we have a very dense population density, because Gaza Strip, as you know, is very, very small geographically, and within that, there's approximately 2 million people. There's bombardments going on every single day. They start early in the morning, sometimes 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. And they're pretty much continual on and off throughout the day. There's a huge amount of destruction of infrastructure. So I'm in Khan Yunis at the moment, and many buildings have been destroyed and flattened. Because of the evacuation order this week, large number of people have had to flee. They're trying to flee to the Al-Mawasi area, which is the so-called protected area, although, as we know, there have also been attacks there, and it's extremely overcrowded there and very difficult to find space. And then on top of that, we have the blockade, which means that people have been extremely hungry, been starving, been malnourished. So when you add all these together, we've got a huge displaced population, many of them displaced many times. They're malnourished. And on top of that, a lot of them are getting wounded and injured in this constant bombardment.
Dr Tommo, given the destruction of the facilities like the burns unit at NASA Hospital, how are medical teams like yourself actually adapting to the situation, and how are you able to treat patients and make sure that everyone is safe and also has nutrition to recover?
Well, the short answer is we can't. We certainly can't make sure everybody is safe, and we certainly can't make sure everyone has nutrition to the amount required. So what we can do is the best with what we've got. So yes, the burns unit was struck earlier in the week. So this had obviously a significant impact on being able to treat the patients there, because they've now had to be transferred to different areas across the strip to different, across the hospital, which means they're not all in the same place, which means it's much more difficult to look after them because you haven't got a dedicated team because they're spread out everywhere. We don't have necessarily the amount of dressings that we would like to treat these patients. So we can treat them, but we can't treat them to the standard which we would like to treat them, and not to the standards that they are used to in peacetime, for example. So it's not that we can't do anything. We have to do something. We cannot just leave these people, but clearly we can't do as well as we would like to, given the circumstances.
And you've urged world leaders to stop talking and to do something. Today, the UN chief has said Israel has only let in a teaspoon of aid so far. It's demanding more, but is just saying this simply enough? Should more actions be taken right now?
Well, I'm a surgeon, I'm a humanitarian, I'm not a politician, but I think, we can see the world over that there's a lot of people out on the streets. There's a lot of anger about what is going on. And I think there's also a lot of anger at world leaders across the globe, not just in specific one or two countries, but across the globe that come out with statements, often repeating pretty much the same thing. We condemn this, we condemn that, we demand that this must happen. But they're just words, and they've been going on for a long, long time, and nothing on the ground has changed. So I think there is, yes, people are feeling very much that the rest of the world is not really doing anything on a concrete basis to affect any sort of change here.
And Dr. Tommo, I'm just obviously listening to you speaking to me, and it's extremely emotional, the situation that you find yourself in and your team. On a personal level, how are you holding up? Are you getting enough support? And what do you need right now, you and everybody, your medical professionals?
Well, I mean, what we need is clear. We need a ceasefire and an opening for humanitarian aid, but that ceasefire has to then lead to a permanent cessation of hostilities, because a ceasefire for a few days or a few weeks, which is then followed by a further escalation in conflict, is just delaying the inevitable. So the politicians and the diplomats and the various governments need to get together to sort that out. From our point of view, unless more food comes in, unless more humanitarian aid comes in, and unless the bombing stops, there's not a lot we can do. We're picking up the pieces, and the health system is extremely badly affected. I mean, many hospitals are out of action. There's no hospital that's functioning at its normal capacity. On a personal level, I mean, we as humanitarian workers, we come here for a relatively short period of time. And, it's important that during the time we are here, we're focused and concentrated on what we're doing. And as you rightly said, it's extremely emotional when you see, children wounded, seriously wounded, with life-affecting injuries, young people dying. It is very, very unpleasant, but you have to cast that aside for the time you're here to be able to do your job. And I'm sure none of the patients that we treat would want to be treated by somebody who's breaking down in front of them. So we just have to get on with the job. And also, for us, it's a relatively short period of time. For the Palestinians that are living here, they've been going through this for 20 months now.
Dr. Tommo Potar, thank you so much for joining me, and you are definitely an inspiration, and thank you once again. It was a pleasure to have you on, and please do keep safe.
Thank you.
A federal judge has temporarily blocked the Trump administration's decision to bar foreign students from enrolling at Harvard. It comes just hours after the university said it was going to sue. Homeland Security officials say the university failed to comply with federal regulations, but Harvard calls the move politically motivated and unconstitutional. Let's go live to Washington now to speak to former US Deputy Envoy Ellie Cohanim. Ellie, great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me. What did you think when you first heard the Trump administration had blocked Harvard from enrolling new international students?
Well, I was really very happy of all the steps that the Trump administration is taking to deal with the anti-Semitism and, frankly, anti-Americanism that's going on at Harvard University and many of our elite institutions here in the United States. In particular, regarding the foreign students, what we know is that Harvard University has something like 27% of their overall university enrollment is foreign students. And the facts that we've seen is that many of those students are the most radical. They're the ones who are participating in this pro-Hamas movement across the country, and of course at Harvard in particular. They have targeted Jewish students and have caused harassment and assault on Jewish students. And Harvard has chosen to fight the Trump administration instead of fighting the anti-Semitism on their campus. They are the ones who are escalating. They could just comply with the demands of the Trump administration. They're refusing to do so. And I think that this case is going to go through the U.S. court system. It'll probably eventually wind up at the Supreme Court. My belief is that it's going to be Harvard that will lose this case.
Ellie, actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about, because it still has some way to go through the courts. And we also have been hearing that a judge has temporarily blocked Donald Trump's want to stop enrolling international students. What exactly does this mean, and where does this leave Donald Trump right now and the administration when it comes to Harvard?
Well, a temporary injunction, what that does is that it kind of puts a temporary hold on the Trump administration's ability to actually take away Harvard's ability to issue they don't issue the student visas, but to be able to permit foreign students to enroll at Harvard. So basically what's happening right this moment is that the situation is on hold. But for long term, I just don't believe that Harvard is going to win this, because the ability to allow international, whether it's students or nationals, into the country belongs to the federal government. And the federal government ultimately decides who they do and don't want to allow into the country. So Harvard has a lot of resources. And again, what's appalling, I think, for us to see right now is that instead of Harvard trying to partner with the White House and this administration and figure out how are they going to resolve their anti-Semitism problem, how are they going to resolve the issue that there are radicals on their campus. And I want to bring something else to your attention. The United States Congress actually has just notified Harvard that they also are investigating Harvard University's ties to the Chinese Communist Party, some work that they're doing together that leads back to China's human rights abuses, as well as some work with the Iranian regime. So Harvard has a lot of troubling ties and troubling decisions that they're making right now. And really the onus is on them. They have decided to fight the Trump administration instead of fighting anti-Semitism on their campus, and it's really a shame on them.
Ellie, I just want to move on to another story quickly. President Trump's much touted big, beautiful bill has narrowly squeaked through the House. How big of a deal is this for the Trump administration?
It's a really big deal because the president was elected with a real mandate from the majority of voters in the country to get through his agenda, his campaign promises. And in order to do that, he really needed the U.S. Congress to fund his priorities and also cut places where he wanted cut, where he'd promised the American people that he would do budget cuts. So the big, beautiful bill, as he has so brilliantly marketed, did pass, as you mentioned, the House by a very slim numbers. And now it's going to be up to the United States Senate to get this bill through the Senate so that it will wind up at his desk and he can vote it into law. And we're confident that the Senate will pass it. I think that there were some changes that were made along the way. And so at this point, it would be incredibly unpopular for the United States Senate to try to come up against the Trump administration and truly the mandate that the administration, the president, has been given by the American people.
And Ellie, 2 Israeli embassy staffers were killed in what's been called a hate-motivated attack in Washington, D.C. How concerned are you about rising anti-Semitic violence in the U.S.? We're just talking about Harvard. And what should the response actually be?
Well, this attack outside of the a Jewish institution is being investigated as a terror attack, And we've seen Judge Janine Pirro, who is prosecuting the case, say that she might even be seeking the capital punishment for the attack. And so I think that should bring some comfort to Jewish Americans and Americans as a whole. But yes, the statistics of rising anti-Semitism in this country are very troubling. And, I would point to figures in the United Nations as an example who spread this blood libel just this week, claiming that 14,000 babies in Gaza were going to starve in the next 48 hours due to Israeli actions. Of course, this libel spread through international media, through the BBC, and into American media as well. Before the UN and the BBC and others retracted it, millions of people had already bought into the lie. And so this is how radicalization takes place. If somebody like an Elias Rodriguez, who traveled all the way from Chicago to Washington, D.C. to execute in cold blood these two Israeli embassy staffers. And so, I point my finger at the United Nations. I point my finger at the university leaders, again, who are failing us in the fight against anti-Semitism. And I frankly also point my finger at the previous Biden administration that allowed a pro-Hamas movement to sweep through American cities for 15 months without pushing back hard enough. And so now the Trump administration and authorities have to clean up the damage that was done for almost 2 years before they came into office.
Former US Deputy Envoy Ellie Cohanim, thank you for joining me on the show. Always a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, President Donald Trump has made a fresh round of tariff threats aimed at both Europe and Apple. Trump says he will put a 50% tariff on all European goods starting on the 1st of June, after saying that trade talks with Brussels were basically going nowhere. He is also warning Apple to move iPhone production to the US or face a 25% tariff on imported devices. For more on this, I'm pleased to say I'm joined by Al Arabiya senior correspondent Carina Kamel. Carina, always great to have you on the show. A lot of news from Donald Trump today, but he is threatening a 50% tariff on the EU. What has been the reaction to this hefty increase on the markets?
We have seen a sell-off across global markets today. European markets closed down sharply lower, and we saw the greatest losses in the French markets, the German markets, and the Italian markets, because their companies will perhaps most be affected by this threat to impose tariffs of 50% as of June 1st. So that's in a matter of days. Interestingly, the London market was down, but not as much as other European countries, and that's because obviously the United Kingdom just a few days ago signed a deal or a preliminary trade agreement with the United States. We've also seen risk-off sentiment in general across markets. If we look at Wall Street right now, markets are down still. They opened down, and the greatest losses today in the United States are on the tech stocks. The Nasdaq perhaps also weighed down by those Apple shares as well, dropping dramatically today. We've seen losses also on the US dollar. In fact, the US dollar is headed for a weekly loss. Gold is up, giving an indication that investors are turning to safe havens in this time of uncertainty. We're seeing also the indices that measure volatility. So the VIX index in Europe is at a 3-week high, and a 2-week high, the VIX index in the United States. If you look at the sectors also, we've seen the auto sector in Europe, that's seen the biggest falls. We've seen also the luxury sector drop nearly 3%. Stocks like Porsche, Mercedes, BMW, all these companies will be directly affected if the tariffs come. And this is really the last thing that markets needed right now, because we're coming off the backs of Moody's downgrading the U.S. debt on Friday last week. As our previous guest indicated, the House of Representatives passed the tax bill, essentially a giant budget bill that will potentially add trillions of dollars to the U.S. debt. Now, that may be good for the Trump administration, but it was very worrisome for investors and indeed the bond market as well. And so the last thing we need is the trade tariff talks coming back into the headlines and weighing on investor sentiment, in addition to all those other factors.
Yeah, and somehow, Carina, we're just seeing the market stabilize after Liberation Day, but risk-off sentiment today, as you did say. Carina, Trump appears to be calling for the return of tariff negotiations between the EU and the US on social media. He is clearly not happy with the progress being made.
Absolutely not. And this is a classic Donald Trump move. Ramp up the pressure just as negotiations are getting underway. And the context of this is that the European Union has revised a previous trade proposal and presented it to its U.S. counterparts earlier this week. So what we're hearing today from the president and from the Treasury Secretary is perhaps their response to this refreshed deal that was offered a few days ago. Donald Trump saying that the negotiations were difficult with the European Union. Scott Bessent saying that the EU was not acting in good faith, comparing how the EU is behaving versus Asian countries, which it said was negotiating, or which he said were negotiating in good faith. Trump going as far as saying that the European Union was created for the primary purpose of competing with the United States on the trade deal. And Scott Bessent also saying that perhaps this threat of additional tariffs, quote, was intended to light a fire under the EU. So it goes back to that negotiating tactic, ramping up the pressure in the hopes of getting some concessions. And the real sort of crux of the matter is that if we look at the trade deficits that the US has with different parts of the world, we talked a lot about China being the number one in terms of that deficit, but actually the European Union is number two. And the deficit is about 250 billion US dollars in goods. And Donald Trump sees that as a very unfair relationship. So the aim of this sort of ratcheting up of pressure and ultimately a deal would be to bring that deficit down and bring the relationship more into balance. Just also to note that we understand a call took place today between the European Trade Commissioner Maros Sefcovic and his U.S. counterpart Jameson Greer. We understood the call took place, it ended, or it began about an hour and a half ago. So far, there has been no indication or no confirmation of what was discussed in that call.
And Carina, just going back to the NASDAQ, you say there's a sell-off on the NASDAQ today. That market is lower. We know that is the tech-heavy market. And as you mentioned, it's down to Apple. Now, what is Donald Trump saying? They could face a 25% tariff possibility. But why is this?
You know, this is not the first time that Donald Trump has mentioned his dissatisfaction with Apple's manufacturing processes. In fact, when he was in Saudi Arabia, he said, I had a call with Apple. I'm not happy that they're moving some of their manufacturing to India from China. We need to understand that 80 to 90% of Apple's iPhone manufacturing takes place in China today. Last year, Apple sold 60 million iPhones in the United States, and the iPhone represents more than 51% of Apple's overall revenue. Therefore, the iPhone is very important for Apple, and China is very important for Apple. Now, we know that Apple, in sort of trying to circumvent the tariffs on China, was going to move its manufacturing to India. Clearly, that is not satisfactory to Donald Trump. What he wants is for Apple to establish manufacturing facilities in the United States. Now, it's worth noting that Apple has said it does plan to spend $500 billion US dollars in the United States in terms of hiring more staff, but also building up facilities in 9 different states. But that investment will not include Apple facilities, Apple manufacturing. And the problem for Apple, and this threat of 25% tariffs could be obviously devastating. Already, Apple said this quarter, without this new threat of tariffs, will cost the company $900 million just this quarter. But the problem is Apple can't just move manufacturing from China in a very short period over to the United States. If you look at the sort of setup it has in China, we talk about these cities, schools, hospitals, their entire cities just essentially created to manufacture iPhones. So it's not very simple for Apple to recreate that in the United States in a short period of time, because essentially the local skills are not available. But that is also what the United States wants to achieve. And Howard Lutnick talk about this. We want to reestablish semiconductor manufacturing and very high level, high tech manufacturing back into the United States. The problem is it doesn't happen quickly.
And Carina, I just want to ask you briefly before I let you go. You mentioned to me that the US dollar is down, gold is up, but I've noticed Bitcoin has really surged in the past few days. And I wanted to know, is Bitcoin becoming the new safe haven?
It is in many ways, and it's not just a safe haven, but it's also an alternative investment in times of geopolitical uncertainty and global market turmoil. On Thursday, Bitcoin reached a record high exceeding $111,000. There's many factors behind this. Obviously, last year, the United States allowed more institutional investors to enter the market through ETFs or exchange-traded funds, which essentially opened up the Bitcoin market to more investors in an easier, more stable way. The other key trigger that led to this increase in the price of Bitcoin over the past few days has been legislation passing through Congress, the stablecoin bill. Stablecoin is a subset of cryptocurrencies, which which is linked to the US dollar. And the US administration is pushing this stablecoin in a big way, and the legislation is progressing through the Senate. That was also a boost for Bitcoin. So given all the kind of environmental factors that are favorable to Bitcoin, if you add to that the fact that investors see it as a hedge against inflation, which is on the rise in places like the United Kingdom and potentially the US, they see it also as a hedge against central banks cutting interest rates, and therefore the return they could get on other assets may not be as high. So it's a hedge against central bank action. It's also a hedge against global uncertainty when you're not wanting to buy stocks, when you're concerned about is exactly what we've discussed, the sort of constant headlines and the markets fluctuating and the volatility in the markets. Perhaps it looks like Bitcoin, comparatively, at least in this environment, could be seen as a more stable investment compared to equities.
Who would have thought that, Carina, just a few years ago? But great to have you on the show. Carina Kamel, thank you very much. A reminder of our top stories. US and Iranian negotiators are in Rome trying to strike a new deal on Iran's nuclear program. Israel's Prime Minister accuses the UK, France and Canada of siding with Hamas, whilst the UN demands Israel allow aid into Gaza. A federal judge blocks the Trump administration's decision to bar foreign students from enrolling at Harvard just hours after the university sues. And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also follow us on X. Counterpoints with Melinda Nusafora will be coming up next. Goodbye, happy Friday, and thank you for joining us.